Hello and welcome. Tonight, as the world outside fades into quiet, we turn back the clock. Back to a time when America had just survived its own undoing. The Civil War had ended, but peace did not come easy. Victory tasted of ashes, and the man who had held the Union together was about to walk into the final act of his life. This isn't just a story of death. It's a story of destiny, of a man who dreamed his own end before it came, of a country reborn, yet haunted by its own reflection. So close your eyes, and let the echoes of history drift softly through the night as we remember the final days of Abraham Lincoln, the president who freed millions, but could not escape the hand of fate. The war is over, yet the land still trembles. Spring, 1865. The fields of Virginia are quiet now, but beneath the silence, the earth remembers. Smoke once rose from these valleys like prayers for the dead. The rivers that once ran red now shimmer under fragile sunlight, and in the White House, a weary man walks the halls in thoughtful silence. Abraham Lincoln. The president who carried the weight of a fractured nation on his shoulders, his eyes once bright with conviction are dimmed now, tired yet gentle. He has seen too much death, too many letters to mothers, too many coffins draped in flags. In these final days, Lincoln seems both here and elsewhere, his body among the living, his mind already walking towards something unseen. Those close to him say he smiled more often now, but with a kind of sorrow behind it, as if he knew the peace he'd built was not meant for him to enjoy. The myths begin here, the whispers of a dream. A week before his death, Lincoln told his friend about a vision. In his dream, he wandered the silent corridors of the White House, hearing the sound of sobbing from a distant room. He followed the weeping to the East Room. There before him lay a coffin, wrapped in black. Soldiers stood around it, guarding it. Lincoln asked one of them, "Who is dead in the White House?" The soldier turned to him and said, "The president. He was killed by an assassin." When he awoke, the dream clung to him like a fog. He told Mary, his wife, who wept quietly. Some dismissed it as exhaustion, but others, especially those who loved him, believed Lincoln had glimpsed his own death. Now, as the country celebrates victory, the man who saved the Union walks beneath banners and flowers, smiling for the crowds who cry his name. But inside, something feels unfinished. He speaks often of rest, of a wish to visit the Holy Land, to finally sleep without worry. He does not know that peace will not come that way. The White House itself feels different these days. The air is heavy with the scent of lilacs. Outside, carriages roll past as the city hums with the energy of renewal. Soldiers return home, freed men walk proudly through streets that once denied them. But every triumph carries a shadow. For every flag raised, a grave remains unmarked. In the evenings, Lincoln rides alone through Washington. His aides say he enjoys the silence, the rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves, the cool air against his face. Once a guard asked why he rode without escort. Lincoln simply smiled and said, "I am in God's hands." Yet even the most faithful heart cannot stop what waits in the wings. In the taverns and secret corners of the city, another man prepares. John Wilkes Booth, actor, Confederate sympathizer, and dreamer of dark dreams. He is handsome, confident, the son of a famous family of performers. On stage he plays heroes. Off stage he believes himself one. To him, Lincoln is not a savior, but a tyrant who destroyed the South. Booth's heart burns with bitterness and vanity. He speaks in whispers to a circle of conspirators, men who once fought for the Confederacy and now cling to vengeance as if it were a prayer. They meet in candlelit rooms, sketching plans on the backs of envelopes, speaking in riddles about redemption and honor. The war is over, but their hearts never left the battlefield. As the days pass, the line between theater and reality begins to blur for Booth. He imagines his name written beside Brutus and Cassius, killers of tyrants. He rehearses his role in the greatest performance of his life, not on the stage, but in history. Fate, it seems, has written two scripts, one for the president who seeks peace, and one for the actor who mistakes murder for meaning. Lincoln, unaware of the danger, continues to move through his days with quiet grace. He visits the troops, holds his wife's hand in the carriage, tells stories to his young son. His laughter returns, light but fleeting. On April 14th, Good Friday, he rises early. He meets his cabinet, speaks of the future, of healing the South, of reconciliation. One of his ministers says Lincoln never looked happier. Perhaps, in some corner of his heart, he believed he had done enough. That evening he plans to attend the theater, Ford's Theater, a play called Our American Cousin, a light-hearted comedy for a tired nation. Mary insists it will be good for him to relax. The box is decorated with flags and flowers. The crowd gathers. The orchestra begins to play. Outside, the city breathes with peace for the first time in years. But somewhere in the darkness, Booth tightens his gloves. The moon rises pale and watchful. The hour approaches. Back in the theater, Lincoln laughs. It's the first real laughter in a long time. He leans toward Mary, his hand resting gently in hers. The audience claps and cheers. No one sees the man slipping quietly through the corridor, pistol in hand, steps echoing like a heartbeat. He opens the door, raises the weapon, and fires. A small sound, a pop, a gasp, and history stops. Lincoln slumps forward. The laughter turns to screams. Mary cries out. Booth leaps to the stage, shouting, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. He lands awkwardly, breaking his leg, but runs anyway, limping into the night. The play continues no more. The theater becomes a temple of horror. Soldiers rush in, doctors follow. The president, unconscious, is carried across the street to the Peterson house. The night deepens. Outside, the crowd swells in silence. Inside, time slows. The room is small, the air thick. Mary weeps at his bedside. The doctors do what they can, but the wound is mortal. Lincoln breathes slowly as if fading into dream, and then, just before dawn, he is gone. Secretary Stanton, eyes wet with tears, whispers the words that still echo through history. Now he belongs to the ages. The city wakes to mourning, bells toll, flags hang in black. The joy of victory dissolves into grief. Trains carry his body through towns and cities, each stop lined with thousands standing in rain and silence. Children clutch flowers, old men salute, women bow their heads. America follows the slow-moving train as if in a trance, saying goodbye to the man who gave everything. But legends do not end at death. They begin there. In the years to come, people will claim to see him, Lincoln's shadow walking the corridors of the White House. Guards will say they hear footsteps near the old office. Presidents will speak of dreams, of a tall figure watching over them in the night. Maybe it is myth, maybe it is memory, or maybe it is the soul of a man who never truly left, watching still over the country he gave his life to unite. And as the stars fade, as history folds back into silence, his words remain. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds. For some wounds never truly heal. They simply learn to live with the memory of mercy. And so, in the quiet of the night, when the wind brushes softly through the trees, perhaps it is not the wind at all. Perhaps it is Abraham Lincoln, still walking beneath the stars where the grass remembers history and freedom whispers his name. The night after the war's end was not filled with speeches or gunfire, it was filled with laughter. Washington, weary and worn, finally breathed again. The city that had known only the sound of cannon fire and funeral drums now trembled with music and celebration. Street lamps flickered against brick walls, the scent of spring and coal smoke mingled in the air, and people spoke in hushed tones about peace, as if saying it too loudly might break the spell. At the heart of it all stood a place of light, Ford's Theatre. Gas lamps burned warm and golden against crimson curtains. Here, a wounded nation had come to remember what joy felt like. The laughter of strangers filled the hall, echoing softly like the heartbeat of hope itself. And somewhere backstage, another man smiled, but his smile carried no peace. John Wilkes Booth. Handsome, celebrated, adored by audiences across the country. The son of a famous acting dynasty, the Booth name was known in every theater from Boston to New Orleans. His voice could command silence, his movements could make men cheer. But offstage, in the privacy of his own thoughts, Booth rehearsed a very different kind of performance. He fancied himself a man of destiny, a Southerner by sympathy, even though he had never fought a single battle. He saw in Lincoln not a savior but a tyrant, a destroyer of his beloved South. The war's end did not bring him relief. It brought him rage. Rage that the Confederacy had fallen. Rage that the world was cheering the man he blamed for it. And rage that in the eyes of history, Lincoln would forever be a hero. So Booth began to rewrite history in his own mind. He told friends that he would do something glorious, something that would make his name immortal. To him, the stage was not enough anymore. The world had become his theater, and he would play its darkest role. Washington, in those April days, was alive with rumors and ghosts. The city still housed soldiers, spies, and widows. Taverns were filled with the echoes of both laughter and loss. Behind every closed door, a memory of war still lingered. And in one such door, on H Street, a group of men gathered under flickering candlelight. Booth stood among them, his dark eyes alive with restless purpose. With him were his co-conspirators, Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, David Herold, and Mary Surratt, the innkeeper whose boarding house became their meeting ground. Each had a role to play in a plan that changed with every telling. First, they would kidnap Lincoln, hold him hostage to exchange for Confederate prisoners. But when Richmond fell, Booth's plan turned from ransom to revenge. He spoke to his followers with the passion of a preacher and the madness of a prophet. He quoted Shakespeare. He called Lincoln the tyrant. He swore that the gods of the Old South demanded justice. In his mind, this was not murder. It was theater, a final poetic act that would restore his world's lost honor. He paced as he spoke, rehearsing words as if for an audience. "The people will thank me," he said. "They will call me a hero." But even his fellow conspirators saw the flicker of something dangerous in his eyes, something that made even vengeance seem small beside his hunger for glory. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the Potomac. Lincoln, unaware of the danger, was planning his evening at the theater. Booth, too, was preparing for the same stage, but with a script written in blood. The myth of the actor who became an executioner begins here. He studied the layout of Ford's Theatre, like a director preparing for opening night. He knew the entrances, the timing of the jokes, even the rhythm of the audience's laughter. He had performed there before. He knew where the shadows fell when the lamps dimmed. He knew where the president would sit. And yet beneath the darkness of his intent, Booth still carried the trappings of a performer. He recited lines to himself as he rode through Washington on horseback, muttering Shakespearean verse. He saw his mission not as sin, but as art, an act of purification, of sacrifice. He would cleanse the nation of a tyrant. He would redeem the South. And in that delusion he became both actor and assassin, hero and monster. The night before his deed, Booth dined with friends, smiling, laughing, drinking wine. He spoke of triumph, of history, of fame. No one guessed what he meant. They saw only the charming man with perfect posture, the velvet voice, the glint of confidence in his eye. No one saw the storm beneath. Later he returned to his rented room and began to prepare. On the small wooden desk sat a map, a pistol, a knife, and a diary. In the mirror, his reflection stared back, handsome, restless, doomed. He wrote a final note, sealing his thoughts with the calm certainty of a man who believed he was chosen. In his journal, he would later write, "Our country owed all her troubles to this man, and God simply made me the instrument of his punishment." The streets outside whispered with midnight air. The wind rustled the flags that had only just been raised in victory. And inside, Booth buttoned his black coat, slipped the pistol into his pocket, and rehearsed once more the scene that would end an era. He saw himself not as a villain, but as a performer stepping into the spotlight. To him, the world was the audience, and history his stage. But history is cruel to men who confuse destiny with desire. For all his confidence, Booth could not see the truth waiting beyond the curtain, that his performance would not crown him with glory, but drown him in infamy. In the quiet before dawn, Washington slept. The city exhaled after 4 years of grief. Candles burned low in homes across the capital. Mothers dreamed of sons who would never return. And in the stillness of the night, one man prepared to kill the dream that had cost so much to build. When Booth rode that morning through the cobblestone streets, the sky above was pale and cloudless. He stopped briefly at a stable, collecting his horse. Witnesses would later recall how calm he seemed, how composed, as if heading not toward murder, but toward a performance he had practiced 1,000 times. Every motion deliberate, every glance rehearsed. It was theater to him, all of it, even death. Ford's Theater waited in the center of the city, its windows gleaming in the afternoon sun. Inside, stagehands hung fresh curtains. The play, Our American Cousin, would draw a full house that night. No one knew that a darker play was about to unfold in its shadows. Booth visited the theater once more during the day, moving through its halls like a ghost. He spoke casually to the stagehands, checked the door to the president's box, carved a small hole in it, just enough to look through, to plan, to see. Then he left, fading into the city's noise as if nothing had happened. But the plan was already alive, pulsing like a heartbeat. He would not act alone. At the same moment Lincoln was shot, Booth's men were to strike at others. Vice President Andrew Johnson, Secretary of State William Seward. 3 blades of vengeance, meant to decapitate the Union in one stroke. The sun set. The streets grew quiet again. And Booth, draped in his black coat, stood in the gathering dark, breathing deeply as if savoring the last moments of his own humanity. He touched the pistol in his pocket. He looked up toward the sky, toward the same stars that had watched over battlefields and burned above Gettysburg, Antietam, and Shiloh. Perhaps they flickered a little dimmer that night, as if they too knew what was coming. For this was not just a killing. It was an ending, and a beginning. The story of a nation that had fought to save its soul, only to watch it shatter in a single shot. And at the center of it all stood one man in a black coat, half hero, half monster, caught forever between theater and tragedy, between performance and damnation. As the lamps of Washington glowed and laughter filled Ford's Theater, Booth waited in the wings of history, ready to take his final bow. He did not know that when the curtain fell, it would never rise again for him. Because that night, art and death would share the same stage, and the applause he longed for would echo only in eternity. The city was changing, but its heartbeat was not yet steady. Washington, spring of 1865. The war's end had come like a sunrise after a storm. but the light revealed only ruins. The buildings still wore scars of war. Streets were heavy with mud and memory. Soldiers limped home through alleys where the scent of whiskey and gunpowder hung together in the same stale air. And beneath the calm surface of the capital, something darker moved, quietly, like a shadow slipping between the gas lamps. By day, Washington was a city of celebration. By night, it was a city of whispers. Taverns brimmed with soldiers telling stories of victory, their laughter laced with ghosts. Widows in black veils walked slowly past shop windows, eyes hollow, searching for something that could not be bought. And in smoky corners men leaned close, their words barely rising above the clink of glass and the creak of floorboards. They spoke not of peace, but of revenge. It was in those corners that John Wilkes Booth found his kindred spirits, men whose hearts had not surrendered, even when their army had. Lewis Powell, tall, strong, simple in his devotion to Booth's cause. George Atzerodt, the nervous boatman who drank to quiet his fear. David Herold, the loyal errand boy, young and eager to please. And Mary Surratt, the widowed innkeeper whose boarding house had become a harbor for conspiracy. They gathered under her roof, behind curtains drawn tight against the night. The table held a few candles, their light trembling against cracked plaster walls. Maps and scraps of paper lay scattered between empty bottles. A pistol gleamed beside a folded newspaper announcing the end of the war. Booth sat at the head, his black hair catching the flicker of light, his eyes alive with restless conviction. The others watched him, listening to his words as if he were some prophet of vengeance. He spoke of honor, of destiny, of the South betrayed. Every sentence was a performance, his voice rising and falling like a sermon. He told them they were chosen, that God himself demanded justice for the fallen Confederacy. He painted Lincoln as a tyrant who had crushed liberty beneath the weight of victory. And in those dimly lit rooms where fear and faith blurred into the same thing, men began to believe him. What began as talk of kidnapping had now turned to blood. Booth no longer spoke of ransom or negotiation. His dream had curdled. Now he spoke of sacrifice, his own and theirs. He told them that if one great man fell, the South might yet rise again. He promised them immortality, though he himself did not know the price. Outside, the wind pressed against the shutters like an impatient messenger. The city beyond was unaware of the web tightening in its heart. Policemen walked their rounds. The Capitol dome gleamed pale against the sky. And yet, beneath those very columns, under that same dome, the foundations of peace were already cracking. Washington had become a stage without knowing it. Every street, every tavern, every flickering lamp was part of the set. And Booth, ever the actor, was already rehearsing his lines. But even he could not see how deeply the old myths ran through his heart. The myths of the fallen South, the unfinished vengeance, the belief that honor could be reborn through blood. In his mind, he was no assassin. He was a knight of some lost cause, an avenger of broken dreams. He saw himself as Brutus to Caesar, striking down a tyrant for liberty's sake. History would see him differently, but history had not yet arrived. For now, only the flicker of candlelight and the smell of damp wood bore witness to what was coming. The conspirators' meetings became more frequent. They gathered in stables, in alleys, in Mary Surratt's parlor, where she poured wine with trembling hands. Powell practiced with his knife. Atzerodt mumbled his doubts. And Booth, ever the director, gave each man his role to play. He promised them that after the deed, they would all escape together. Across the river into Maryland, through the forests to the south. Freedom waited, he said. Glory waited. But what waited in truth was fire. The nights grew heavier as April deepened. Sometimes the men sat in silence, listening to the rain on the roof. Even Booth's voice grew softer, more haunted. He began to talk of fate, not just politics or vengeance, but something larger. He claimed he had been born for this, that he felt it every time he stepped onto a stage. His friends could not tell if it was inspiration or madness, maybe both. Washington streets, meanwhile, whispered their own rumors. People spoke of Southern agents still hidden in the city, of plots to burn, of secret vengeance yet unspent. The fall of Richmond had not ended the war, it had simply driven it underground. Now it walked the streets in shadow, disguised as faith, as duty, as loyalty. By day, Mary Surratt went about her errands, her face calm, her bonnet tied neat. She carried messages, rented rooms, and said her prayers. But her boarding house had become the heart of a ghost, where old loyalties still breathed and new sins were born. She told herself she was only helping friends, not traitors. But the truth is never that clean. Evening after evening, Booth returned. He would pace the parlor, restless, animated, every word burning with theatrical force. Sometimes he read aloud from Shakespeare lines of heroes and tyrants, of betrayal and fate. To him, these were not just plays, they were prophecy. And always the others watched him, caught between awe and fear. He had a kind of magnetism that made doubt seem like cowardice. And in that small, flickering room, he turned belief into obedience. Beyond the city, the ghosts of Richmond's fall still lingered. Rumors drifted north of Confederate gold hidden in swamps, of generals who vowed to fight on from exile. Tales that would never prove true. But belief has a way of breathing life into lies. Booth fed on them, weaving them into his vision of destiny. He said the Confederacy was not dead. It was sleeping, waiting for a single spark to wake it again. That spark, he decided, would be his pistol. The closer the day came, the more the city itself seemed to hold its breath. At night, the Potomac lay still and black beneath the stars. Carriages rattled past in silence, their lamps swinging like tiny comets through the mist. Inside the boarding house, the men planned and prayed and drank. Each felt the pull of something irreversible, though none dared speak it aloud. It was not courage that bound them, it was despair. Despair disguised as duty, wrapped in the rhetoric of lost causes. They were men trying to turn defeat into meaning, to carve purpose out of ruin. And Booth, with his actor's charm and his poet's madness, gave them that illusion. He told them the world would remember their names. He promised that their act would restore balance to history. But the truth, the terrible truth, was that the world would remember their names for reasons they could never bear. As the final days of the conspiracy drew near, even the air seemed tense, as if the whole city could feel the weight of something waiting to happen. Booth's diary grew darker. His entries spoke of destiny and divine will. He wrote that his hand would be guided by justice, that God would forgive him. But the gods of war had long stopped listening. And so, beneath the marble columns of the Capitol, beneath the laughter of taverns and the prayers of churches, a silent storm gathered. No one saw it forming, no one except the man in the black coat whose heart had turned theater into prophecy. Soon the stage would be set. The lights would rise, and the city that had spent 4 years trying to survive death was about to meet it again, face to face, inside the very theater that had become its sanctuary. For now, Washington slept, unaware that history was already pacing behind the curtains, waiting for the cue that would end an age. The Capitol streets held their breath. The stars hung low and still above the dome. And in the quiet between one heartbeat and the next, a whisper passed through the night, not of peace, but of something far older. the ancient vow that no war truly ends until vengeance has had its final word. He had always been a man touched by dreams. Even in the hardest days of war, when the nation tore itself apart, Abraham Lincoln carried within him a quiet world of visions, strange, symbolic, unsettling. He believed in some private way that dreams were messages, warnings from something beyond reason, beyond the waking world. And perhaps one of them was. It was a few nights before the end, before the laughter at Ford's Theatre, before the pistol, before the scream that froze a nation. Lincoln had fallen into a troubled sleep. The war was nearly over, yet peace weighed on him more heavily than battle ever had. In the dream, he wandered the halls of the White House empty, silent, washed in a pale, unearthly light. Every door stood open, every shadow seemed alive. He moved through room after room, searching for the source of a faint, sorrowful sound, the sound of crying. The voices were low, mournful, like distant music. At last he reached the East Room. There, in the center of that vast and solemn chamber, lay a coffin draped in black. Soldiers stood at attention around it, their faces solemn, their eyes fixed forward. A shrouded figure rested within, still and pale. Lincoln asked one of the guards, "Who is dead in the White House?" The guard turned to him and said softly, "The president. He was killed by an assassin." Lincoln stood frozen. He leaned forward, trying to see the face beneath the shroud, and as he did, the dream dissolved into darkness. He awoke in his bed, drenched in cold sweat. And though he would try to shrug it off, that dream never truly left him. He spoke of it later to his wife Mary, to a few trusted friends. Mary Todd. Lincoln was no stranger to omens. She too believed in signs, in the thin veil between this world and the next. When Lincoln told her of the dream, her eyes filled with fear. She begged him to be cautious, to avoid public gatherings. But how could a president retreat from his own people? He smiled gently and said, "It is only a dream." Yet his voice, she would recall, carried a tremor. The story would echo long after his death, told by those who loved him and by those who sought to make sense of his fate. A dream so vivid, so haunting that it seemed less like prophecy and more like memory sent backward through time. But that was not the only dream. Lincoln's nights were filled with them symbols that blurred the line between heaven and history. He once told a friend that he often dreamed of being carried swiftly across a vast ocean as if bound for some distant shore. Each time that dream came, he said, great events followed, and now, near the end, that same vision had returned again and again. Perhaps he already knew. Not in words or logic, but in the deep language of the soul, the kind that speaks in shadows and symbols. The war had changed him. His face had grown older, lined by sorrow and sleepless nights. The photographs from his first year in office show a man of iron resolve. Those from his final months, a ghost wearing flesh. He carried the deaths of hundreds of thousands in his heart, and among them, one that never healed. Willie, his beloved son, gone at just 11 years old. The fever took him one February night in 1862, while the White House outside still glittered with receptions and the sound of carriages. Lincoln had held the boy in his arms as the light faded from his eyes. For weeks afterward, he wandered the corridors at night, unable to sleep, whispering prayers that no one heard. Servants told of finding him in the crypt at Oak Hill Cemetery, standing silently beside the coffin, as if waiting for Willie to awaken. Grief had become his companion, and in that grief, the veil between life and death had grown thin. It was Mary who sought comfort in seances, in spiritualists and mediums who promised a bridge to the other side. But Lincoln's faith was quieter, more private. He did not seek to summon the dead, yet sometimes, it seemed, they came to him. The dream of the East Room was only one among many signs that flickered through his final days. He spoke often of feeling strangely unbound, as though part of him already stood somewhere beyond reach. Friends noticed it too, a distance in his gaze, a weariness that no triumph could erase. He told one visitor that he had never felt so anxious about the future. The war might be ending, he said, but there is something yet unfinished, something I cannot see clearly. The night before his death, as he walked with Mary, he spoke of what they would do after leaving Washington. He dreamed of visiting the South, of rebuilding, of seeing the land at peace again. Mary would later recall how he seemed almost boyish that evening, smiling, light-hearted, free for the first time in years. It was as if, she said, a great weight had been lifted. But behind that lightness, perhaps he already knew his reprieve would be brief. The dream had already written its ending. In the final days of his life, the White House itself seemed to echo with a strange stillness. The East Room, where his dream had placed his body, had long been the house's chamber of mourning. It was where presidents and heroes had lain in state, where the nation had come to grieve. Lincoln had seen it many times. Perhaps some part of him recognized its silence too well, its solemn familiarity. When he told his cabinet of another strange dream, a vision of a phantom ship gliding swiftly over dark waters, they laughed gently. The war had just ended. Perhaps it was only the weight of exhaustion, they said. Lincoln smiled, but his eyes were far away. He told them, "I know not what it portends, but I have had it before, and always before some great event." And this time, he could not shake the feeling that the voyage would be his last. Historians have long debated these dreams. Were they real, or born later from grief and memory? Did Lincoln truly foresee his own death, or did those who loved him find comfort in the idea that fate had whispered to him beforehand? Perhaps it does not matter. What matters is what those dreams reveal, the burden of a man who bore both the nation's suffering and his own, and who felt somehow that his journey was nearly done. For a man so rational, so steeped in law and reason, Lincoln had an almost mystical acceptance of destiny. He once said, "I am driven by events, events have their own will." He believed in purpose, in the moral arc of the universe, though he could never see where it would end. Maybe that is why the dream did not terrify him as much as it should have. Perhaps, in some quiet corner of his heart, he welcomed it. He had seen too much death to fear his own. He had watched fields of young men vanish beneath the smoke of battle. He had signed letters to mothers whose sons would never return. And he had walked among the wounded, their eyes following him with a kind of reverence that broke his heart. What was one man's death besides so many? If his own end could somehow seal the healing of the nation, he would accept it. But still, the dreams came. One night, he told Ward Hill Layman, his friend and bodyguard, about the East Room vision once again. Layman begged him to take precautions to avoid the theater, to increase his guards. Lincoln smiled faintly, shaking his head. "There are some things we cannot run from," he said. "If it is to be, it is to be." That resignation was not hopelessness. It was peace. He had lived long enough in war to understand that some destinies arrive no matter how tightly we bolt the door. And perhaps that acceptance was his last act of courage. In those final hours before April 14, 1865, Lincoln moved through the day with an almost uncanny calm. He met with his cabinet, spoke of rebuilding the South, laughed with his son Tad. He told a friend that he felt strangely happy, happier than he had in years. The war was ending. The nation was healing. He spoke of the future, of redemption, of light after so much shadow. But somewhere deep inside, the dream was still unfolding. The ghostly East Room, the soldiers, the draped coffin. And when he stepped into Ford's theater that night, smiling beneath the soft gaslight, perhaps the scene felt oddly familiar. Perhaps he had already been there before, not in body, but in vision. And when the fatal shot echoed through that crowded hall, when the great heart that had carried a nation finally stilled, history caught up with the dream. 2 days later, his body lay in the East Room. The same room he had seen in his vision. The soldiers stood as they had in his dream, heads bowed, the coffin draped in black. The air was thick with incense, candle smoke, and grief. Mary Todd Lincoln wept softly beside him, her mind echoing the words he had spoken, "My own corpse." Outside, the rain fell quietly against the windows. The city mourned. And across America, people whispered that Lincoln had known that the dream had been more than imagination. Maybe it was. Maybe some part of him had already crossed that distant shore he saw in his other visions. Maybe the dream was not a warning, but a farewell. He had lived long enough to save the Union, but not long enough to see its peace. He had freed millions from bondage, yet could not free himself from fate. And so the myth endures of the president who dreamed his death, who walked the halls of his own tomb before he entered it, who seemed in those final days more spirit than flesh. The dream that warned him has become part of the nation's own memory, a haunting echo that reminds us that even history, like life, is shaped as much by mystery as by reason. For in the quiet of that dream, beneath the flicker of ghostly candlelight, Abraham Lincoln seemed to glimpse what few ever do, the end of his own story and the beginning of his immortality. April 14th, 1865. Good Friday. The morning air of Washington smells of lilacs and distant rain. The cannons have gone quiet, but the scent of gunpowder still lingers as if the city itself cannot quite believe the war is truly over. Abraham Lincoln rises early. He has slept little, yet his face carries an uncommon calm. For the first time in 4 long years, there is peace, fragile, flickering, but real. He dresses simply as always. Black coat, worn boots, a face lined by both sorrow and forgiveness. He hums an old tune as he fastens his collar. Mary watches him quietly, noting the light in his eyes, a brightness she has not seen since before the war. Outside, the morning sun paints the city in gold. Carriages roll over cobblestone, the Capitol dome gleams, and soldiers stroll arm in arm with sweethearts. The Union flag waves lazily above the White House, its colors no longer a banner of division but of endurance. The president steps out into the spring air, breathing deeply. He tells his doorkeeper, "I never felt so happy in my life." He is thinking of the future of the country reborn, of homecomings, of rebuilding what war had broken. And perhaps, somewhere beneath those thoughts, he feels that other presence too, the quiet inevitability he has long carried in his dreams. But this morning, he chooses light. Lincoln has a carriage prepared. He and Mary set out for a ride through the city, waving to crowds that gather along Pennsylvania Avenue. Children shout his name, soldiers salute, women toss flowers into the street. He smiles and lifts his tall silk hat in return. The lilacs bloom thick and fragrant near the riverbanks, and for a moment the city feels almost holy, as if washed clean by peace. They pass the War Department, the Treasury, and finally the Capitol, its steps still marked by the boots of soldiers, its marble facade gleaming like a promise. Mary turns to him. "Do you remember? she says softly. How heavy it all seemed just a year ago. Lincoln nods. I do, he replies, but it is finished now. The work, the sacrifice, it was not in vain. He pauses, watching the Potomac shimmer in the distance. I see the end of our troubles, he continues, and I want to see this country at peace. We must bind the wounds, not open them again. There is warmth in his voice, but also something else, the quiet tone of a man closing a long chapter. Later, they visit the Navy Yard. Lincoln gazes at the captured Confederate ironclads, silent and rusting at their moorings. He touches one of their cold steel sides and says, "Strange how men can shape such engines of death, and yet be called to mercy by the same hand that forged them." The officers with him exchange glances. They know his words carry more than reflection, they carry a farewell. By noon he returns to the White House. The building hums with quiet celebration. Secretaries, messengers, and servants smile as he passes. The war's end has lifted every heart. Lincoln greets them with gentle words, as though blessing his own household one last time. He meets with his cabinet in the afternoon, lights slanting through tall windows. They discuss Reconstruction, the fate of the South, the release of prisoners. When the topic of punishment arises, Lincoln shakes his head. "No," he says, "we must be generous. The war is over. Let us treat them as if they had never been our enemies." His voice carries the same compassion that once silenced the anger of his generals. To some, it sounds like forgiveness. To others, like prophecy. Before the meeting ends, he turns to his Secretary of War and says with quiet joy, "I think it is time to lay down the burden." The men nod, though none realize how close that truth is. Outside, the day drifts lazily toward dusk. The air smells of rain and lilacs again. Somewhere across the city, another man is dressing too, not for peace, but for destiny. John Wilkes Booth stands before a mirror in his boarding house, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusts his tie. An actor's face, handsome, intense, every line sharpened by conviction. He whispers to his reflection, reciting words he has rehearsed in secret for weeks. Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants. The phrase rolls from his tongue like a ritual. To him, it is not murder, it is justice, history, theater, and martyrdom all at once. Booth has played heroes and villains, lovers and kings. But tonight he plays himself, a man who believes his act will free a nation betrayed by victory. He paces the room, clutching a small Derringer pistol and a dagger. On the table beside him lies a crumpled note, the final words he will leave behind. He writes of vengeance, of duty to the South, of divine purpose. His handwriting shakes, yet his resolve does not. Outside, his horse stamps impatiently in the stable. Booth glances out the window. Washington glows with twilight. Somewhere, laughter rises from the streets. The city is alive again, blind to the shadow walking among it. Across town, the orchestra at Ford's Theater begins to warm its strings. Inside, gaslight flickers against red velvet curtains. The scent of perfume, tobacco, and fresh wood fills the air. Couples find their seats, chatter hums like distant rain. The play tonight is a comedy, Our American Cousin, a light-hearted tale of manners and mischief, chosen to lift the capital's weary heart. No one knows that history's darkest act is about to unfold upon that very stage. Lincoln has promised Mary an evening of laughter. She had long begged him to rest, to escape the endless tide of politics and grief. He finally agreed. As the carriage rattles down the avenue toward the theater, the setting sun glows like fire over the city's rooftops. He leans back, smiling faintly. "How peaceful everything seems," he murmurs. Mary squeezes his hand. "It feels as though the war has truly ended," she says. In another part of town, Booth mounts his horse. He rides swiftly through narrow alleys, coat billowing, eyes burning. He has coordinated his plan. Other conspirators will strike at the same hour. Vice President Johnson. Secretary Seward. Booth's mind dances with visions of chaos, the Union decapitated in a single night. But he thinks most of Lincoln, the man he believes has destroyed the South. To Booth, this night is theater's greatest performance, history's final curtain call. He whispers a prayer, or perhaps a curse, and disappears into the darkening streets. Inside the White House, the president's son, Tad, plays by the fire. Lincoln bends to kiss him goodnight, promising they will ride together again soon. Tad laughs, wrapping his arms around his father's neck. The sound of that laughter will echo in Mary's memory forever. The carriage stops before Ford's Theater at about 8:30 p.m. Crowds cheer as the President and First Lady step down. The orchestra halts briefly, and the play pauses mid-scene as the audience rises to its feet. "The President of the United States!" someone cries. Applause swells like thunder. Lincoln bows humbly, smiling as he and Mary are escorted to the presidential box above the stage. With them are Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris Young, glowing, unaware of the shadow waiting nearby. The play resumes. Laughter ripples through the theater. Lincoln settles into his seat, amused, relaxed, his tall frame bathed in warm light. Below, hidden in the crowd, Booth watches. Every gesture, every movement rehearsed. He knows the timing of the play by heart. He knows the moment when the audience will laugh loudest, the line that will cover the sound of a gunshot. He moves quietly up the back stairs, familiar to him as any stage. He passes a man in the hallway, nodding politely, all charm and ease. No one questions him. He is John Wilkes Booth, famous actor, familiar face. In his coat pocket, the small pistol waits cold and heavy. His heart beats fast but steady. Destiny, he believes, is near. Back inside, the play continues. Lincoln leans toward Mary, whispering something that makes her laugh softly. She will remember that moment, the warmth of his voice, the brightness in his eyes. It will be the last thing she remembers before the sound. Booth reaches the door to the box. He wedges it shut behind him with a wooden stick, trapping everyone inside. Then he steps forward, silent as shadow. Below, the audience roars with laughter at a clever line. "You sock-dologizing old man trap!" Booth raises the derringer. He aims. The pistol flashes once, a small spark in the dark. The sound is soft, barely louder than a pop. For a heartbeat, no one moves. Then Mary screams. Lincoln's head falls forward. Blood blooms across the flag-draped balcony. The laughter dies. Chaos erupts. Rathbone lunges at Booth, but the actor slashes with his dagger, cutting deep into the major's arm. Booth vaults over the railing, his boot catching on the flag as he falls. He lands hard on the stage below, his legs snapping. Still, he rises wild-eyed, triumphant, consumed by his own legend. He brandishes the dagger toward the stunned audience and cries out the words of ancient vengeance, "Sic semper tyrannis." Then he limps across the stage, vanishing into the wings, swallowed by darkness. For a long moment, the theater stands frozen, a painting of disbelief. Then suddenly, the screams begin. Doctors rush forward. The orchestra stops playing. Mary clutches her husband's face, whispering his name again and again. The audience pours into the street, shouting that the president has been shot. Horses thunder through the night, soldiers rally. The joy of peace vanishes in an instant, replaced by horror. Outside, Booth rides into the darkness, his broken leg throbbing, his heart aflame with delusion. He believes he has struck a blow for liberty. But history will name him what he truly is, a murderer in love with his own myth. Inside the theater, Lincoln is carried from the box to a small boarding house across the street. He does not speak. He barely breathes. The night is still warm with spring air, but inside that room it feels as though winter has returned. The hours pass in candlelight. Mary sits beside him, trembling, whispering prayers through tears. Outside, the crowd gathers, thousands standing in silence, waiting for word. At 7:22 a.m., April 15th, Abraham Lincoln takes his final breath. A doctor murmurs, "Now he belongs to the ages." And just like that, the curtain falls. The play has ended. The laughter of Ford's theater fades into memory. The gaslights flicker out. And the man who carried the weight of a nation, who dreamed his own death before it came, slips quietly into legend. Washington will never sound the same again. The lilacs that bloomed that morning will now forever smell of morning. And history, from that day forward, will always pause at April's curtain call. The night peace was born and a president died beneath its fragile light. It happens in less than a heartbeat. A moment so small, so fragile that the universe itself seems to hesitate before letting it unfold. A single spark in the dark, the crack of a pistol no louder than a cough. And then silence. The laughter that had just filled Ford's theater, the bright bubbling sound of a nation exhaling after years of war, dies instantly. It is replaced by something heavier, an impossible stillness, like the air itself refusing to move. For one eternal breath no one understands. The actor has spoken his line, the audience has laughed, and now what is this sound? A trick of the play? A burst of stage powder? But then they see her, Mary Todd Lincoln, standing, screaming, reaching for her husband as his head falls forward, his tall frame collapsing like a marionette whose strings have been cut. Abraham Lincoln does not cry out. He does not move. The bullet, small as a fingertip, has entered the back of his skull and lodged behind his right eye. One shot, one breath, one end. The world tilts. The room seems to tremble under the weight of history itself. Booth stands frozen for a moment, eyes blazing, the pistol smoke curling like a phantom halo around him. Then he turns, slashes at Major Rathbone with his dagger, the blade catching flesh, drawing a streak of red, and leaps over the railing. The flags draped over the presidential box wrap around his spur as he falls. The silk tears. He lands hard on the stage below, his legs snapping with a sickening crack. The crowd gasps, but before they can move, he rises, his face twisted in pain and glory. He raises the dagger high, shouting words that will echo for centuries, "Je sic semper tyrannis." Thus always to tyrants. Some say, he added, the South is avenged. Others say his cry was swallowed by the chaos. But all agree the theater for one blinding instant became the stage of eternity. Booth limps across the floorboards, half crawling, half running toward the wings. The audience still cannot grasp what has happened. An actor, a pistol, a president, all fused into nightmare. Mary's scream shatters the trance. Then, pandemonium. Men leap from their seats, women faint, soldiers push forward, shouting for light, for doctors, for mercy. The play is gone. The night has become a wound. On the stage, the portrait of George Washington hanging above the curtain seems to gaze down silently, as if bearing witness to the breaking of another republic's heart. Lincoln lies motionless in the box, his head resting on Clara Harris's lap. Blood stains her white dress. Mary clutches his hand, sobbing, calling his name again and again. Her cries echo through the theater like prayers lost in a storm. Doctors rush forward, among them Charles Leal, a young army surgeon barely in his 20s. He climbs the railing, pushes through the crowd, and kneels beside the president. He places 2 fingers against Lincoln's neck, a faint pulse, but fading. "He still breathes," Leal whispers. The words spark a desperate hope, a fragile illusion that maybe, just maybe, the story is not over. They tear away his collar, loosen his shirt, searching for the wound. There is no blood on his chest, only a small dark mark behind the ear, a hole that seems almost too small to matter. But they know. They know what it means. The bullet has already done its work. Leal leans close, holding Lincoln's head steady as others shout for water, for light, for air. He says softly, "He is dying, but he shall not be left to die here." The soldiers lift him carefully, reverently, carrying him out of the box and down the narrow stairs. His tall frame barely fits through the doorways. The crowd parts like water as they emerge into the night. Outside, the April air is cool and damp. A light drizzle begins to fall soft, almost tender, as if the heavens themselves have begun to mourn. Across the street, a man opens the door of his boarding house, the Peterson house, and the small procession carries the wounded president inside. They lay him on a bed too small for his body, his legs hanging off the edge. Candles are lit, curtains drawn, doctors whisper. Mary weeps. And above it all, the clock ticks steadily, marking the slow collapse of time. Back in the theater, chaos reigns. Men storm the stage, searching for the assassin. But Booth is already gone, riding into the dark on a horse that seems as haunted as its rider. He flees south, through alleys and shadows, the pain in his broken leg twisting his vision. He believes he has done something divine. He believes he has restored balance to a world undone. He believes his name will be remembered as a savior of the South. He is right, but not in the way he dreams. In the White House, word spreads like wildfire. Messengers gallop through the night, knocking on doors, shouting through the rain. Cabinet members, generals, senators, all summoned in disbelief. The president has been shot. The city, once filled with celebration, now trembles under a blanket of fear. Lanterns flicker in every window. Men clutch rifles, whispering that the Confederacy has risen again. Church bells toll without rhythm. The sound of mourning begins before death has even arrived. In the Peterson house, the doctors work by candlelight. They remove blood from his mouth, adjust his position, try everything that medicine can offer, and yet they know. The wound is mortal. The brain has been shattered beyond hope. Mary sits at his side, her face pale as marble. Her hand rests on his, whispering fragments of their life together, the children they lost, the nights of war, the hope of peace that he had carried like a flame. She calls his name softly, as if he might return from somewhere just beyond reach. But he does not. The night stretches on, endless. Outside, a crowd gathers in the street. Men remove their hats. Women weep openly. Even the soldiers who had fought only days ago now stand shoulder to shoulder in silence, united by grief. Inside, the air grows heavy. The candles flicker. The doctors fall quiet. Lincoln's breathing becomes shallow, rhythmic, mechanical, each breath a slow surrender. The sound of the clock grows louder, as though time itself has chosen to bear witness. And then, at 7:22 in the morning, April 15th, the breathing stops. Dr. Leal lowers his head. He whispers the words history will never forget. Now he belongs to the ages. Mary's cry pierces the silence. It is the sound of a heart breaking in a way no words can describe. Outside, the crowd feels it, a collective shudder, as though the nation's very soul has exhaled for the last time. Some fall to their knees. Some pray. Some simply stand, unable to believe that the man who had carried them through war has fallen in peace. The shot that killed Lincoln was small, almost delicate. A .44 caliber pistol, a single ounce of lead. And yet, its echo will last forever. It did not just kill a man. It stopped the momentum of history for a moment, froze the pulse of the world, caught between grief and disbelief. It was as if time itself paused to honor him, or perhaps to ask, how could this happen? The myths begin immediately. Some whisper that Booth was an agent of the devil. Others claim Lincoln's dream had foretold this, that his death was divine retribution or martyrdom. There are even those who say that on that Good Friday, God took his chosen servant just as his son had been taken centuries before. Whether divine or human, the meaning hardly matters, the result is the same. The healer of a nation becomes its martyr. The man who ended war falls not by sword or cannon, but by theater's smallest weapon, a pistol fired in the glow of gaslight. By noon, messengers carry the news across the city, across the country, across the world. Telegraph wires hum with sorrow. The president is dead. In New York, church bells ring. In Boston, factories fall silent. In Chicago, crowds kneel in the streets. Even in the defeated South, many weep not out of loyalty, but because something larger than politics has died. In every home, it feels as though the world has dimmed. Children ask their mothers why the flags hang low. Old men stare at the sky, wondering if the war had claimed one more victim after all. That evening, as the body is prepared, the air grows heavy with the scent of lilacs again, the same flowers that bloomed on the day of his last sunrise. They will follow him in every town his funeral train passes through, from Washington to Springfield, that long, slow pilgrimage of mourning. Some say the bullet killed more than a president, it killed the last innocence of America. The dream of perfect union, of reconciliation untainted by revenge. After Lincoln, nothing would ever feel as pure again. The myths only deepen. A few whisper that the clock in the theater stopped at the moment of the shot. Others say they saw Lincoln's face glow faintly, as if illuminated from within. A poet writes that the stars themselves dimmed in morning. Perhaps they did. History, after all, is not built only of facts. It breathes through the stories we tell when truth is too heavy to carry alone. And so the shot becomes more than murder. It becomes symbol, the breaking of an age, the sealing of a legacy. The bullet that pierced Lincoln's head pierced also the heart of the century. Through that wound, 1,000 new stories would emerge of justice, of vengeance, of redemption. But in that first moment, when the pistol cracked and time stood still, there was only one thing left in the air: silence. The kind of silence that lives forever. Booth would flee, hunted and limping for 12 days. His name would become a curse, his act an abomination. And yet, in his own mind, he died believing himself a hero. That is the cruelty of history. The villain always believes he has heard the voice of God. For those who remained, however, the truth was simpler. A good man had died. A tired, gentle man who carried too much of the world's sorrow and still believed in kindness. A man who dreamed of unity, even as fate wrote division. And when that single ounce of lead left the barrel, all the world's noise stopped, and for a breathless instant, eternity leaned close to listen. The shot that stopped time still echoes in the marble halls of Washington, in the quiet rooms of memory, in every moment when peace trembles under the weight of hate. And in that echo you can almost hear his voice, soft, forgiving, eternal, the voice of a man who knew that even death cannot silence mercy. The healer had become the martyr. The clock had struck eternity, and the world, for the briefest of moments, forgot how to breathe. The night swallows him whole. John Wilkes Booth rides hard into the Maryland woods, the pistol still warm in his hand, the echo of that single shot still chasing him through the dark. Behind him, Washington burns with noise and confusion, shouts, bells, hooves striking cobblestone. Ahead, only the forest, the moon, and the sound of his own ragged breathing. He believes he has struck a blow for the South, for honor, for history. But history has already turned its gaze away. He's no longer an actor, no longer a patriot. He is a hunted man beneath a blood-red moon. The horse's hooves pound the earth like a funeral drum. The air smells of pine and damp soil, of gunpowder and guilt. Every sound feels magnified: an owl's cry, the snap of a twig, the thunder of his own pulse. He looks back again and again, half expecting to see blue-coated riders emerging from the mist. But there is only the endless dark. Somewhere far behind, in the Peterson house, Abraham Lincoln is breathing his last. The two men, one dying, one fleeing, share the same night, the same stars, the same terrible silence. One drifts toward eternity, the other races toward damnation. Booth's leg throbs with pain. The jump from the balcony has shattered his fibula. Each movement sends waves of agony through his body, but he grits his teeth and presses on. He rides south toward Maryland, toward the fading dream of the Confederacy. The war is over, but Booth has not accepted it. In his mind, the cause still breathes defiant, noble, unbroken. He crosses the Navy Yard bridge at midnight. The guard hesitates, unsure whether to stop him. Booth flashes a smile, that charming, confident actor's smile that once melted audiences. He says he's riding to visit friends in the country. The guard waves him through. History holds its breath as the assassin slips into the shadows beyond the city. His companion, David Harold, follows close behind, young, nervous, devoted. He rides not out of courage, but because he cannot turn back. Booth has the look of a man possessed, and Harold, like so many before him, has fallen under his spell. The road to freedom feels endless. The night air chills their faces. Every tree seems to whisper. The stars above, dimmed by clouds, offer no comfort. It is as if the heavens themselves refuse to witness what he has done. By dawn, Booth's leg has swollen so badly he can barely stand. They arrive at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, a Maryland physician, a man known to Booth from theater circles and Southern sympathies. Booth knocks softly. When the door opens, Mudd finds before him not a famous actor, but a ghost in flesh, pale, sweating, trembling with pain. Booth tells a lie, or half a lie. A riding accident, he claims. A broken leg on the road from Washington. Mudd says nothing, but he sees the glint of metal beneath Booth's coat, the pistol. He hears the horse outside, restless, flecked with foam. He feels somehow the weight of sin in the air. Still, he binds the wound. He splints the leg, wraps it tight. He gives Booth a place to rest. But by morning, word of the assassination spreads like wildfire. The president is dead. The city is under martial law. Rewards are promised. Suspects named. The hunter has become the hunted. When soldiers come knocking, Dr. Mudd denies everything. But the truth, like smoke, cannot be contained. Booth's name is already on every tongue. Every mile of road now feels like a noose tightening. The fugitive rides again, clutching his injured leg, his mind feverish. He crosses fields and rivers, sleeps in barns and thickets, moving only by night. Each step takes him deeper into the swamps of southern Maryland, closer to Virginia, closer to whatever fate waits for him there. The newspapers call for vengeance. Posters bloom on every wall, promising gold for his capture, dead or alive. His own face stares back at him from the paper, handsome, proud, infamous. Once, that face drew applause. Now it draws gunfire. Booth cannot accept it. He believes history will vindicate him. He writes by flickering lantern light in his diary the last performance of his life, the script of a madman trying to justify murder. He writes, "Our country owed all her troubles to this man, and God simply made me the instrument of his punishment." He convinces himself he acted in divine purpose, that the shot was righteous. But even in his own words, doubt begins to seep through the ink. The pain in his leg worsens. The nights grow colder. Harold urges him to surrender, but Booth refuses. "I prefer death to capture," he whispers, eyes gleaming in the dark. They move from safe house to safe house, Confederate sympathizers who feed them, hide them, or look away in fear. But even among allies, Booth feels the walls closing in. The South, he fought for, no longer exists. Its flags are trampled, its cities burned, its soldiers disarmed. He rides through a ghost nation, and he knows it. At one farmhouse, an old woman gives them bread and water. She says nothing, but later, when the soldiers arrive, she tells them he looked like a man already dead. Booth dreams feverishly. He dreams of the theater of applause, of bright lights, of his father's voice telling him that greatness comes at a price. He wakes in sweat, whispering lines from Shakespeare. He sees Lincoln's face in the dark, pale, serene, forgiving. He tries to banish it, but it follows him step for step through every mile of his escape. By the sixth day, the country has turned into a single vast net. Telegraphs hum with orders. Cavalry detachments comb every forest, every creek bed, every barn. The assassin's name is spoken with equal parts rage and fascination. In taverns, men drink to his death. In churches, ministers call him a demon. In whispered corners, a few still call him a hero. But mostly he is cursed, a wandering soul marked for judgment. In the swamps of Zekiah, Booth hides among reeds and water snakes. The mud sucks at his boots. Mosquitoes swarm his face. He writes again in his diary, the words trembling from fever. I am abandoned, with the curse of Cain upon me. He feels pursued not just by soldiers, but by something older, guilt, fate, the ghost of the man he killed. Harold tries to comfort him, but Booth's mind drifts in and out of delirium. He speaks to shadows. He mutters scripture. He hears phantom hoofbeats behind him. Sometimes he believes he is being guided by divine hand. Other times he curses God for forsaking him. And always the moon follows him, that same red moon that hung over Ford's theater. To the frightened farmers who glimpse him from afar, he becomes a figure of legend. A man on a black horse, face white as bone, vanishing into the fog. Even after he is gone, they will whisper of him. Booth's spirit still rides through the swamps, they'll say. A man who killed a nation's hope and could never find his way home. On the 10th night, Booth and Harold finally cross the Potomac River into Virginia. They drift through darkness, the current pulling them off course, the stars blotted by cloud. Water seeps into the boat. Booth stares ahead, eyes hollow, leg trembling with pain. Each stroke of the oar feels like the heartbeat of a dying world. When they reach shore, Booth collapses, kissing the wet sand. Now I am in Dixie, he murmurs. But even he knows the Confederacy is ashes. There is no Dixie left to save him. They find refuge at the Garrett farm, a quiet homestead surrounded by tobacco fields. The family offers them shelter, not knowing who they are. Booth limps to the barn, lays down in the hay, and for the first time in 12 days, sleeps deeply. But dawn brings horsemen. The cavalry has followed his trail at last, the 16th New York Regiment, led by Lieutenant Edward Doherty. The circle has closed. The end has come. The soldiers surround the barn. They call out to Booth and Harold to surrender. Harold does, stumbling out, hands raised, pleading for mercy. Booth refuses. I will not be taken alive, he shouts. His voice echoes through the rafters, defiant, theatrical, final. He limps to the doorway, rifle in hand. The soldiers set the barn ablaze. Flames lick the walls, crawl up the hay, fill the air with smoke. Inside, Booth coughs, squints through the haze, his face glowing orange with firelight. He raises the rifle, aiming toward the shapes beyond the doorway. A shot rings out, not his. Sergeant Boston Corbett has fired through a crack in the wall. The bullet pierces Booth's neck. He falls to the ground, paralyzed, choking, staring up at the rafters as flames dance above him. The irony is cruel. The actor who killed with one shot now dies by one. The soldiers drag him from the burning barn and lay him on the grass. His lips move. They lean closer. He whispers, "Tell my mother I die for my country." Then, after a long silence, one last line, faint, broken, theatrical to the end. Useless, useless. He dies as he lived performing, even in defeat. The clock that began with Lincoln's heartbeat now stops with his. The longest 12 days in American history are over. They wrap his body in a blanket, carry him away on a wagon, and with him, the last ghost of the Confederacy begins to fade. But the legends do not die. They grow. They change. They haunt. For years, travelers along the Potomac claimed to see a rider in black galloping through the fog, his horse leaving no tracks, his eyes burning with fever. They called him the ghost of the swamp, the restless spirit of John Wilkes Booth, doomed to flee forever from the crime that ended an age. Some swore they heard hoofbeats on still nights, or saw lantern light moving through the trees when no man was there. Others said the owl's cry at midnight was his scream, echoing from beyond. And in quiet towns across the South, mothers told their children, "Don't wander near the woods after dark. Booth still rides there, looking for his peace." History remembers the facts, the manhunt, the barn, the bullet, the end. But the myth remembers something deeper. That night itself seemed to chase him, that the world turned its back on him, that his escape was never truly an escape at all. 12 days and an eternity. A single act of madness and a nation's unending sorrow. The long night's ride was more than flight. It was the last shadow cast by war itself. And when the flames consumed that barn, when the smoke rose into the dawn, it carried with it the final breath of an era, the end of vengeance, the end of illusion, and the beginning of myth. Even now, when the wind moves through Maryland's woods, you can almost hear it, the echo of hooves, the whisper of a man's voice repeating his final word, soft as smoke fading into eternity, useless, useless. April 15th, 1865. Dawn creeps slowly over Washington, soft, pale, uncertain. Inside the Peterson house, the air is still heavy with candle smoke and whispered prayers. And then, at 7:22 in the morning, it happens. The breath stops. The silence deepens. Abraham Lincoln, the man who held a broken country together, breathes his last. Mary's cry shatters the quiet. It is not just a wife's grief. It is the sound of a nation breaking. The doctors step back. Their hands tremble, their faces pale. And Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, stands at the bedside, eyes glistening. He looks upon Lincoln's still face, the blood-streaked pillow, the faint curl of hair over his brow, and whispers the words that will echo forever. Now he belongs to the ages. Outside, the world holds its breath. The street beyond the boarding house fills with people, soldiers, mothers, freedmen, children, all waiting, not daring to speak. When the window curtains are drawn shut, a wave of understanding ripples through the crowd. The president is gone. And then, all across the Capitol, a strange quiet descends. Church bells begin to toll, slow, deliberate, mournful. The same bells that had once rung for victory now ring for loss. Flags fall to half-mast. Windows are draped in black. Every door seems to whisper farewell. Washington, once alive with the sound of parades and laughter, now becomes a city of weeping. Even the soldiers, hardened by years of war, stand in the streets with tears streaking their faces. Some remove their hats. Some kneel. Some stare blankly at the sky as if hoping for one more miracle. Mary Todd, Lincoln, cannot be comforted. She weeps for her husband, for her children, for the years of sorrow that had haunted their home. In that narrow room, she clings to his hand as if the warmth might return. But the man she loved has crossed into history, leaving her in the quiet shadow of eternity. Word spreads like fire. Telegraphs hum through the morning. The president is dead. From Washington to New York, from Boston to Chicago, the message flashes faster than the sun's rise. Each city pauses, stunned, disbelieving. And then the morning begins. In the streets of New York, men remove their hats as black crepe hangs from every window. In Philadelphia, church bells toll for an hour without stopping. In small towns, school children cry openly, their teachers unable to speak. In Charleston, the cradle of rebellion, even the defeated pause in silence. A Southern woman writes in her diary, "We did not think we could weep for him, but we do." The Capitol becomes a shrine. Crowds gather outside the White House gates, carrying candles, singing hymns in trembling voices. Soldiers keep watch through the night, guarding not the body of a leader, but the spirit of a nation in mourning. Inside, they place his body in a simple coffin of walnut and lead. A black cloth covers the casket, atop it a wreath of white lilies. Mary cannot bear to see it. As the days pass, the mourning spreads like a tide across the continent. From the Atlantic to the frontier, every church tolls its bell, every flag droops in windless sorrow. It is as if the entire nation has stopped breathing, caught between disbelief and devotion. And then the journey begins. The funeral train. On April 21st, 1865, a black-draped locomotive steams slowly out of Washington. Its whistle sounds like a cry through the morning fog. On its side, a sign reads, "Our martyred president." Its destination, Springfield, Illinois. Home. For 12 days and nights, the train moves across the heart of America, the same route that once carried Lincoln to his inauguration, now reversed in mourning. It is a journey not of politics, but of pilgrimage. Every stop becomes sacred ground. In Baltimore, men who once jeered him now kneel in silence. In Philadelphia, they place his coffin in Independence Hall, where the Declaration of Independence was signed, as if the two great dreams of liberty have at last come together in one room. Tens of thousands file past in tears. Some touch the coffin, some whisper prayers, some faint from grief. At each station, the scene repeats. Townspeople standing in rain, clutching candles, waving flags edged in black. Children held on their parents' shoulders to glimpse the passing car. Old veterans saluting in silence. Freedmen kneeling on the tracks, sobbing as the train moves through the night. In New York City, 1 million people line the streets. The casket moves slowly through a canyon of black-draped buildings, past weeping crowds, through canopies of mourning cloth that ripple like waves. Church choirs sing hymns that dissolve into sobs. One reporter writes, "The city itself seems to weep." The train passes through fields, forests, rivers, each mile carrying with it the hum of sorrow and the birth of myth. It rains almost everywhere it goes, as though the heavens have chosen to accompany the cortege. When sunlight breaks through, it feels unearned. When wind stirs the flags, it feels like breath returning to a stunned world. In small towns, people wait all night, just to glimpse the dark shape passing in the distance. Farmers light lanterns by the tracks. Widows stand with bouquets of lilac. Union soldiers remove their caps and bow their heads. Even Confederate prisoners in faraway camps pause their meals to pray. A poet writes, "The train moved as a dream through a land half awake." And so it does not merely a funeral, but a vision of America grieving itself, mourning not just a man, but an age. For many, Lincoln becomes something more than human. He becomes myth, the first great American martyr, a man who freed the enslaved, who died for union and mercy, a second Moses, they said, who led his people to the promised land but did not live to enter it. And the myth grows with each passing mile. In every town, people cut pieces from the black bunting to keep as relics. Children press flowers to the tracks, believing the wheels have sanctified them. Preachers speak of divine purpose, of sacrifice, of a soul too good for the earth it saved. In Springfield, they prepare the tomb. The old courthouse square becomes a sea of faces. When the train finally arrives, at 9 a.m. on May 3rd, the crowd falls into silence so deep it seems to still the wind. The coffin is carried down from the car by Union soldiers, men who once fought under his command, their eyes shining with tears. The city bells toll 100 times once for each year of the life they wished he had lived. They carry him through streets lined with flowers and tears. At the Oak Ridge Cemetery, beneath a canopy of willows, they lower the coffin into the tomb. A bugle sounds. The crowd bows their heads. And with that last echo, the war finally feels truly over. But the mourning does not end. It becomes something eternal, something sacred. Lincoln is no longer just a man. He is a symbol of what the nation wishes it could be. Gentle, steadfast, forgiving. Pain turns to legend. Legend turns to faith. In churches, ministers call him a chosen vessel of providence. In cabins and parlors, his portrait is hung like an icon. Stories of his dreams and his final words become scripture for a new republic learning to live again. Some say his death purified the nation, that through his blood, America found redemption. Others say it marked the beginning of the end of innocence, that from his death onward, something pure in the country's heart began to fade. But everyone agrees. He died not as a politician, but as a prophet of mercy. And yet the mourning is not without anger. Crowds demand vengeance. The hunt for Booth and his co-conspirators grows fierce. Men shout for justice or for blood. For some, grief becomes fury. But even in death, Lincoln tempers it. When his words are read again, words of forgiveness, of binding wounds, of malice toward none the nation begins to understand. He did not seek retribution. He sought healing. And in dying, he gave that lesson to all who remained. Weeks later, the last of the conspirators are captured. Booth lies dead in a barn in Virginia. But the image that endures is not his fall, it is Lincoln's stillness, his peace, his immortal quiet. The martyr endures, the killer vanishes. That is how history writes its poetry. In the years to come, children will ask their parents where they were when the president died. Elderly veterans will tell of the night the bells tolled and how even the stars seemed dimmer. And across every border of politics, color, and creed, the story will be retold not as the tragedy of a man, but as the sacrifice of a savior. The myth grows with retelling. Some say angels stood at his bedside. Others say the moment he died, a great light filled the room. There are those who claim the air smelled of lilac, the same flowers that bloomed that Good Friday morning. Even skeptics admit that the timing, the poetry, the symmetry of his death feels divine. Like Moses, they say, he saw the promised land, the end of slavery, the rebirth of union, but could not enter it. His work was complete, but his life was the price. And so the man became the message. The martyr became the myth. And the myth became the soul of a nation. In the years after, when America faltered again, when cities burned, when hearts hardened, when people forgot, his memory would return like a light in the fog. A reminder that mercy is stronger than revenge, and hope, though wounded, never dies. On the anniversary of his death, they still toll the bells. They still drape the flags. And in Springfield, the tomb remains quiet beneath the willow trees. Visitors still come not to see a grave, but to feel the echo of something greater than history. A sense that goodness, though fragile, can shape the fate of nations. As evening falls on that first day of mourning, a soft rain begins again in Washington. It falls on the rooftops, on the muddy streets, on the flag above the White House hanging limp in grief. The same rain that fell when the war began, the same rain that fell when it ended. In that quiet rhythm, the story feels complete. The war that tore a nation apart began with cannon fire, it ends with raindrops. The man who freed millions dies not in battle but in peace. And though his heart has stopped, his voice still moves through pages, through generations, through the soul of America itself. History records his death as tragedy, but time remembers it as transformation. For in that moment, when the bells tolled and the black cloth fluttered in the spring wind, America learned that even the end of a life could mark the beginning of a legend. He no longer belonged to the living. He belonged to the ages, and the ages have never let him go. The war had ended. The president was gone, and yet the thunder did not fade. In the weeks after Lincoln's death, America seemed trapped in a fever dream of grief and fury. The flag still hung in black, the bells still tolled, but now the mourning had teeth. Someone had to pay. The nation demanded justice or vengeance, depending on who you asked. The newspapers screamed for blood. "Find them," the headlines read. "Find every man who helped murder our president." And so the net spread wide. Through burned-out cities and backwater towns, through farms and alleys and safe houses, soldiers and detectives rode out under moonlight, hunting the living ghosts of that April night. John Wilkes Booth was dead shot and burned in a tobacco barn in Virginia. But his shadow still moved through the land. And for those left behind, that shadow became a noose. In Washington, the prisoners were gathered one by one, 8 in all. 8 names that history would soon whisper like a curse. Lewis Powell, who attacked Secretary Seward in his sickbed. George Atzerodt, who lost his nerve and fled before he could strike the vice president. David Herold, who fled with Booth and led the pursuers to that final barn. Michael O'Loughlin and Samuel Arnold, conspirators from the early plotting days. Dr. Samuel Mudd, the man who set Booth's broken leg. Edmund Spangler, the stagehand at Ford's Theatre, accused of helping Booth escape. And one woman, Mary Surratt. They were locked inside the old Arsenal Penitentiary, a fortress on the river's edge, its thick walls sweating with spring heat, iron bars, bare cells, guards at every door, bayonets gleaming. Each night the air filled with the sound of chains shifting, the shuffle of boots, and the low murmur of prayers that went unanswered. But none drew more attention or more pity than the woman. Mary Surratt, a widow, a boarding house owner, a mother. Her home, the place where Booth and his conspirators met in secret, became the spider's web at the heart of the plot. And now, the woman who once poured tea for her tenants faced the gallows. The trial began on May 10, 1865, in a stifling military courtroom inside the arsenal. No jury of peers, no open air of civil law. Only soldiers in uniform sitting in solemn judgment. Before them sat the accused, their faces drawn and pale under the flickering lamplight. The war had ended, but mercy was still in short supply. Witnesses came and went. Some lied, some wept. Some swore they had seen Booth at Surratt's house whispering of escape routes and horses. Others claimed she knew nothing, that she was only a woman swept into the storm of men's crimes. But to the public, the verdict had already been written. Someone had to die for Lincoln, and a woman's neck would do. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered daily, shouting, praying, arguing. Vendors sold pamphlets of the trial proceedings like theater programs. "Justice for Lincoln," they cried. But beneath the noise, something darker pulsed, the quiet realization that vengeance, once awakened, cannot easily be satisfied. As the trial dragged on, the city around it seemed haunted. Rumors of Lincoln's ghost began to drift through the streets, stories whispered by night watchmen and White House staff. Some claimed they heard footsteps pacing the old corridors of the executive mansion. Others swore they saw his tall shadow reflected in the glass of the East Room, where his coffin had once rested. Even Mary Todd Lincoln, drowning in grief, told friends she could feel him beside her in the dark, that he came to her in dreams, his face serene, his eyes full of sorrow. A nation, desperate for comfort, began to believe the dead still walked among them. And perhaps in a way they did. For every evening, as the guards locked the prisoners away, the river wind carried a sound, faint, rhythmic, like hammering wood. The carpenters building the gallows worked by torchlight, their silhouettes long and skeletal against the walls of the prison yard. The scaffold rose higher each night. Timbers creaked, nails drove home, and with each strike of the hammer, the conspirators' fates were sealed. On July 6, 1865, the sentences were announced: 4 to hang, 4 to live. Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, David Herold, George Atzerodt. They would meet the rope together at noon the next day. When the news reached her cell, Mary fainted. When she woke, she begged for mercy, not for herself, but for her son, John Surratt, who was still at large, still running. She wrote a final letter to President Andrew Johnson, pleading for life. He never answered. That night, the prison fell into a silence so thick it seemed alive. Guards whispered prayers. Priests came and went with candles and crosses. Powell prayed aloud for forgiveness. Atzerodt wept uncontrollably. Herold trembled like a child. Mary sat quietly, her rosary clutched in shaking hands. She whispered over and over, "I am innocent, God knows I am innocent." But God was silent. At dawn, the execution yard filled with soldiers. Rows of bayonets glinted in the sunlight. Civilians were barred from entering. Only a handful of witnesses and officers stood inside the walls. The gallows loomed above them, rough wood, 4 ropes swaying in the morning breeze. At 11:30, the prisoners were led out. Their steps were slow, the air heavy with heat and dread. Powell's face was serene, almost radiant, as if he had already left this world. Herold stumbled, eyes wide with terror. Atzerodt could barely stand. Mary Surratt walked last, veiled in black. She leaned on a priest's arm, her lips moving in silent prayer. She was the first woman ever to face federal execution in the history of the United States. They climbed the scaffold together. The crowd held its breath. The ropes were placed. The hoods drawn. The priest murmured the last rites, and then a single command. The trapdoors fell. The ropes snapped taut. 4 bodies dropped as one. A gasp rippled through the air, not of triumph, but of horror. Even the soldiers looked away. For a long moment no one spoke. Only the creak of the ropes broke the silence. When it was done, the bodies were cut down and buried within the prison walls. The sun set blood-red that evening and rain began to fall. But justice did not end there, nor did it rest easy. For many who had called for blood soon found themselves haunted by conscience, by regret, by dreams of faces beneath black hoods. Even the executioner was said to have woken screaming, seeing their eyes in the dark. And in Washington, rumors grew not just of Lincoln's ghost, but of Mary Surratt's. They said her spirit lingered in the prison yard, walking the scaffold steps on summer nights. Some guards swore they saw her black veil drifting above the grass, or heard the whisper of her final prayer carried on the wind. Others said the sound of the trapdoor opening could still be heard at midnight, a reminder that vengeance has its own echo. As for Booth, his death became its own theater. 12 days after the assassination, cornered in Garrett's barn in Virginia, he had refused to surrender. The soldiers set the barn ablaze. Flames roared through the wooden beams, lighting his face in flickering orange. He raised his pistol, shouted defiance, and then a shot rang out. He fell, paralyzed, his body half in firelight, half in shadow. As they dragged him from the burning barn, Booth looked up at the soldiers and spoke his final words. Useless, useless. No one could ever agree what he meant. Useless his cause, his crime, his life. No one knew. But those two words became the last line of a tragedy that had begun on a stage and ended in flames. They buried him secretly, under cover of night, in an unmarked grave. For years, rumors persisted that he had escaped, that the man in the barn was someone else, that Booth still wandered the South, hiding his face behind false names. Every few years, someone claimed to have seen him in Texas, in Mexico, in London. The myths never stopped. They still haven't. And in the White House, the lights sometimes flickered in the night. The guards swore they saw Lincoln's ghost pacing the halls, pausing before the door to the old East Room, the place of his final vigil. Later presidents would speak of it too. Theodore Roosevelt heard footsteps. Winston Churchill, staying as a guest, claimed he saw Lincoln standing by the fireplace, gazing into eternity. Even Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands fainted when she saw him in her doorway, tall and spectral in the half-light. It was as though the man who died for peace refused to rest until peace itself was kept. And the man who killed him, the restless spirit of Booth, was doomed to wander forever. There were whispers among sailors on the Potomac that a figure on horseback sometimes appeared along the riverbanks, cloaked in black, riding hard into the mist, only to vanish when the moon rose. They called him the Phantom Rider. Some said it was Booth, doomed to flee without end the price of his own betrayal. Others said it was the ghost of vengeance itself, searching for forgiveness in a world that had none left to give. By the end of that long summer of 1865, the gallows were dismantled. The prison fell quiet. The war was over. The blood had been avenged. But peace, true peace, did not come. The country rebuilt itself, but the cracks remained, and in the cracks grew the myths of curses, of spirits, of divine justice. Each retelling softened the horror into legend until the gallows and the ghosts became inseparable. Justice and sorrow entwined like vines on a grave. When the wind blew across the Potomac, it carried the scent of lilacs and smoke, the same air that had filled Ford's Theater that fatal night. And people would pause, look toward the river, and whisper the old stories. Of the president who still walked by night. Of the assassin who could never find rest. Of a nation still haunted by its own reflection. Because even now, a century and a half later, the echoes remain. Every time the theater curtains open, every time a bell tolls in Washington, every time someone speaks of Lincoln's mercy or Booth's madness, the story breathes again. Not as vengeance, not as tragedy, but as warning. For history, like a ghost, never truly dies. It waits in the shadows of gallows, in the corridors of power, in the hearts of those who remember. And when the world grows quiet, you can almost hear it whisper, the rope, the hood, the silence. Justice paid its price, and sorrow never left its side. They buried him long ago, but he never really left. His story, like the nation he saved, refused to stay still. The world moved on, cities rose, wars came and went. Generations passed, yet somehow in the stillness of night, his footsteps were always near. The president who would not die. In the years after Lincoln's death, America learned to live again. But it did so with a kind of cautious reverence, as though walking through the ruins of a sacred dream. The wounds of war had closed, but the scars remained visible in fields where bones still slept beneath the soil, in families divided by memory, in the hush that settled whenever his name was spoken aloud. people didn't speak of him as they did of other men. They spoke of him as though he had crossed some invisible threshold from leader to legend, from man to myth. He had become something both holy and human, a spirit that belonged not to one age, but to all time. The myths began almost immediately. They said that on stormy nights, when the lightning flashed over the Potomac, you could see him at the window of the White House, tall and still, his silhouette framed in the glass. Sometimes he would pace slowly, as he had in life, his hands clasped behind his back. Other times, he would stand motionless, gazing toward the Capitol, the same building he once watched rise during war, its dome incomplete, its promise uncertain. Guards spoke of hearing faint footsteps in the empty corridors long after midnight. Doors would open and close on their own. A faint scent of cigar smoke would drift through the East Room, though no one inside had lit one. And every now and then, someone would claim to see him. The tall figure in black, the tired eyes, the kindness that seemed to glow even from the shadow of death. Theodore Roosevelt was the first president to speak of it openly. He said he felt Lincoln's presence in the White House on nights when the nation seemed uncertain, as if the old spirit came to remind him that duty was heavier than fear. During the dark hours before America entered the Great War, visitors reported seeing the same light in the old Lincoln bedroom, a glow that flickered through no lamp burned within. Decades later, Dwight Eisenhower would walk the same halls, leading a country through another kind of conflict, cold, unseen, but no less dangerous. He too spoke quietly of feeling watched, not by menace, but by memory. Sometimes, he told an aide, I think he walks beside every president who enters this house. And perhaps he does. For whenever the Republic faces its trial, whenever the nation trembles between war and peace, the stories begin again. They said Lincoln appeared before the Second World War, before Pearl Harbor, before the Cuban Missile Crisis. A shadow by the window, a whisper in the hall. As if he still tried in death to warn the living. But maybe it was not the man they saw. Maybe it was the idea of him. Because Lincoln, more than anyone else, became America's conscience. A figure carved not just in marble but in myth. A symbol of sacrifice that time could not erode. His story became scripture for a divided people, the parable of humility, courage, and the price of mercy. When visitors enter the Lincoln Memorial today, they often fall silent without knowing why. The great seated figure, hands resting on the arms of the chair, eyes gazing forward, not stern, but sorrowful. Above his head are the words of his second inaugural address, with malice toward none, with charity for all. It is not a monument to victory. It is a cathedral to forgiveness. People whisper there. Some pray, some weep, and some swear they feel something, a presence, an echo, a warmth in the air that seems to pulse with invisible life. Children say it feels like standing near someone who understands you completely. Old soldiers say it feels like standing before an old friend. The myths followed his memory across the land. In Springfield, Illinois, his home became a shrine. Locals told stories of candles flickering on their own, of a faint baritone voice humming old hymns late at night. They said that on the anniversary of his death, the air would turn cold even in spring, and the church bells would sound softer, as if ringing through water. At his tomb, the caretakers sometimes found flowers laid in perfect silence, no footprints leading to or from them. And every so often, someone would claim they saw a tall shadow leaning against the bronze door, bowing his head, always at dusk, always when the light turned gold. They called it superstition. But even the skeptics admitted there was something about Lincoln that never entirely belonged to the grave. In the White House, Generations of presidents learned to live with his ghost. They did not fear him. They respected him. It was said that Franklin Roosevelt would pause by the Lincoln portrait during the Second World War, whispering to it before making decisions that could cost thousands of lives. Eleanor Roosevelt once said she felt Lincoln near her husband, especially during nights of bombing in London, like a guardian spirit reminding him to be kind even when the world was cruel. And then came the night when Winston Churchill, the great bulldog of Britain, stayed as a guest in the White House. He had just finished a late bath, steam filling the room, when he stepped out wrapped in a towel, only to see Lincoln standing by the fireplace. Tall, pale, and silent. Churchill, never short on words, simply said, "Good evening, Mr. President. You seem to have me at a disadvantage." Lincoln smiled faintly and vanished. Churchill told the story for the rest of his life. He swore it was not fear he felt, but a deep, solemn peace. Years later, during the Cold War, Ronald Reagan's aides reported strange happenings too. Footsteps, whispers, sudden drafts in closed rooms. Reagan's dog, Rex, refused to enter the Lincoln bedroom, growling at an invisible figure near the corner. Reagan's daughter, Patty, later wrote that her father often paused in that same room, staring out the window, saying softly, "You can almost feel him here." And maybe that was the truth, that Lincoln had never left the house he died serving. He had simply changed forms, from flesh and blood into memory and myth, from president into protector. But what truly made him eternal was not the ghost stories, not the sightings, not the flickering lights. It was what he left behind, the dream he carried, the dream he died believing in. That a nation so torn apart by hatred could somehow, someday learn to heal itself. That mercy could survive war. That compassion could coexist with strength. His assassination made him a martyr, yes, but martyrdom alone does not create immortality. What made Lincoln immortal was that he had already lived as if he belonged to something greater than life. He had spoken of forgiveness while others demanded vengeance. He had reached out to enemies while others sought retribution. And when the bullet found him, it could only kill the man, not the message. In the decades that followed, his words became woven into the very rhythm of America. School children recited them. Politicians borrowed them. Dreamers built their causes on them. And across every struggle that came after civil rights, equality, freedom, his voice returned again and again like a guiding wind. Martin Luther King Jr. stood before the Lincoln Memorial and spoke of a dream, and as his voice rose over the crowd, many said they could feel Lincoln there listening. A century apart, their words became a single echo, that the promise of liberty was not complete until all could share it. That the work of freedom did not end in 1865, it only began. And so the myth grew, not smaller with time, but larger until it no longer belonged to history, but to eternity. In the eyes of the world, Lincoln became something more than a president. He became a parable of the human spirit itself, flawed, weary, yet endlessly striving toward light. The log cabin boy who rose to greatness. The lawyer who spoke for the voiceless. The leader who carried the burden of a broken nation on his shoulders. And when the weight finally crushed him, he did not vanish. He transformed. He became a symbol, a dream given form, a reminder that even in the darkest hours, decency matters more than power. Some say every nation needs a ghost, a figure who lingers to remind its people who they are and what they once stood for. For America, that ghost is Abraham Lincoln. He walks through its memory like a silent guardian, watching, waiting, reminding. When the country forgets itself, his words rise again from old speeches and yellowed pages, gentle but firm. Let us have faith that right makes might. Government of the people, by the people, for the people. shall not perish from the earth. And every time those words are spoken, it is as if the curtain between past and present lifts, and the tall man in the black coat steps once more into the light. There is a story told by a White House usher of a quiet night near midnight when the house was empty, the corridors dark. He had finished his rounds and passed by the old Lincoln bedroom. As he reached for the light switch, he felt a hand firm, steady rest on his shoulder. He turned, but no one was there. Only the faint smell of tobacco and a whisper soft as a sigh. Take care of them. He never told the story publicly, but those who knew him swore he carried that moment for the rest of his life. And so the myth continues. Sometimes it flickers in the corner of a dream, sometimes in the rustle of the flag, sometimes in the hush of a crowd when his name is spoken. He belongs to no single party, no single creed, no single century. He belongs to anyone who believes that mercy is not weakness, and that freedom once born must be tended like a fragile flame. They say that when great souls die, they do not vanish. They simply expand, becoming part of everything that still breathes. Perhaps that is what happened to him. Perhaps Lincoln became the quiet conscience of the land he gave his life for, a wind that stirs the trees, a light that lingers on the Potomac, a shadow that watches from the marble of his memorial. And perhaps when night falls over Washington and the world grows still, he walks once more through the corridors of the house he never truly left. Not in anger, not in mourning, but in faith. Faith that the dream he died for still lives. Faith that the Union he saved will remain worthy of saving. Faith that even now, the better angels of our nature might yet be heard. So if one evening you stand beneath the stars and hear the faint toll of a distant bell or catch the scent of lilacs drifting through the air, remember this. A man once walked this earth who believed that goodness could survive even the darkest war. He fell to a bullet but rose in spirit. He left the stage, but the story never ended. Abraham Lincoln, the president who would not die. The dreamer who became the dream. The light that refused to go out. And somewhere in the silence between one heartbeat and the next, if you listen closely, you might still hear him walking.